Act 2 of Macbeth. It was a dark and stormy night. Okay, it was at least dark, and Banquo was walking the halls of the castle at night with just a light, a torch. And who does he run into but Macbeth? And so, you know what happens. They're like, hey, who are you? And he's like, hey, it's Macbeth, no worries. And Banquo's like, I can't sleep. I keep having nightmares of those crazy witches. And Macbeth's like, oh, I haven't thought too much about that. Whenever you have a chance, you and I need to have a chat. And then Banquo leaves. Of course, we know Macbeth's been thinking about nothing but the witches. However, he doesn't want Banquo to know that. So then things get really weird. Remember, this is the night they've made the plan. They want to kill Duncan. And that's what Macbeth is actually going out to do. So, all of a sudden, he sees something. In line 34, it says, "Is this a dagger which I see before me?" So he has a vision of a dagger floating by him. The handle toward my hand as if it's begging him to take it. Come, let me clutch thee. So you can imagine, we don't have stage directions here, but he's reaching for the dagger that just appeared in the middle of the air, in the middle of the night when he's going to kill Duncan. And he says, I have thee not, and yet I still see thee. So he's reaching for the dagger, and his hand's just passing right through it. Creepy. Art thou not, fatal vision, sensible to feelings as to sight? Or art thou but a dagger of the mind? Are you real, or are you my imagination? And he says, I see thee yet, in form as palpable as this which I now draw. So he says, I see you, just like this one. And he pulls his own dagger out. Okay? And then he says, you must be showing me the way I'm supposed to go. So he thinks this dagger is leading him to Duncan's bedroom. Now, this is not a clean, nice, polished dagger. It is dripping with what he says in line 46, dungeon gouts of blood. Okay? And it wasn't there before. So all of a sudden, there was a dagger, and then it's covered in blood. Very creepy. Very suspect. And so at this point, Macbeth takes it as a sign that he's supposed to kill Duncan. And he hears a bell ring. That's a symbol from Lady Macbeth that the guards are drunk, and he can go get Duncan. And so he says, I go and it's done. The bell invites me. Hear it not, Duncan, for it is a knell or bell that summons thee to heaven or hell. In other words, it is the bell that marks your murder. And that ends scene 1. So Act 2, Scene 2 finds us back in Macbeth and Lady Macbeth's bedroom, and Lady Macbeth is there waiting for her husband to come back from doing the awful deed, killing Duncan. And so he returns. And do note that an owl is shrieking. Remember that whenever something of evil, of magnitude happens, nature responds in Shakespeare. And so, of course, he has an owl shrieking. So there they are in their night clothes. And Lady Macbeth's kind of thinking out loud. She's like, the drink that made the guards get knocked out and pass out made her bold. So in other words, she can hold her liquor better than those guardsmen. But she says this. She couldn't kill Duncan herself, because that must be a question you're asking. I mean, if she wants Duncan dead so much, why doesn't she just do it instead of forcing Macbeth to do it? Well, she says she couldn't do it herself because Duncan reminds her too much of her father. Now, isn't that a strange little note to put in there? So in other words, she talks a big game, but maybe isn't as bold as she lets on, which is interesting. Anyway, Macbeth comes in. They have this nice conversation. Did you do it? Yeah, I did it. He's dead. And then Lady Macbeth's like, well, tell me about it. Well, I was killing him, and the guys that were there with him stood up. They woke up, and one of them cried murder in his sleep, and And it scared them, so they decided to pray to go back to sleep. And I was there, Macbeth says, and I wanted to pray with them, and I wanted to say amen, but I couldn't pray. Now, this shows the guilt of his conscience for killing Duncan. And Lady Macbeth says, don't worry about it, honey. Just don't think about it. And she says, and this is important in line 36, these deeds must not be thought after these ways. So in other words, we have to put this out of our mind. We can't think about it anymore, because if we do, it will make us mad. And that's foreshadowing, because we're gonna have to go a little crazy later in the play, Lady Macbeth. Anyway, and so very famous lines. Then Macbeth says this, so I thought, I heard a voice cry, sleep no more, Macbeth does murder sleep. Now that's interesting, because he's murdering Duncan in his sleep. Well, what's going to happen, in Shakespeare, you're not allowed to sleep if you have a guilty conscience. And so we're going to find from here on out in the play, Macbeth's not going to be able to sleep. So in a very kind of metaphorical way, he did murder his own sleep because he murdered his innocence. Okay? Then Lady Macbeth gets on him. She calls him brain sickly, calls him feminine, womanly. And this is the part where Macbeth's hands are covered in Duncan's blood. Okay, he's just killed him. His hands are covered in blood. And she says, go get some water and wash this filthy witness from your hand. Wash the blood from your hand. And at that point, she realizes that he's still holding the dagger that he used to kill Duncan. And she's going, whoa, why do you have these? You were supposed to leave them with the guards to make it look like the guards killed Duncan. And Macbeth's like, I can't go back there. It's too much. I'm afraid to think about what I've done. I can't look on it again. And Lady Macbeth's like, give them me, weenie. I'll go do them. Don't be a coward. And so she goes to do that. And at that point, Macbeth looks at his hands. And these are those famous lines where he says, what hands are here? Looking at his own hands. What hands are here? Ha! They pluck out mine eyes. Will all great Neptune's ocean wash this blood clean from my hand? No. This hand will rather the multitudinous seas incarnadine, making the green one red. In other words, all the oceans can't wash the blood from my hand. If I were to try, the blood from my hands would turn all of the oceans red instead. That's how evil a thing I've done. Okay, so Macbeth immediately feeling the guilt of murdering Duncan. Now, it's interesting to note, well, let me say this first. Lady Macbeth comes back and makes an interesting remark. She says, my hands are of your color. So in other words, I've bloodied my hands too. So she went, dipped the daggers in King Duncan's blood, and then put them on the guards to frame them. But she says this, my hands are of your color, but I shame to wear a heart so white. Okay, so our hands are the same color, both colored in blood, but unlike you, I'm no coward. Now that's interesting, because remember, she couldn't kill Duncan because he looked like her dad. Macbeth's the one that actually killed Duncan. He just can't go back and look at it after he's done it. Now, notice the contrast. Macbeth was just saying, all the water in the world can't clean my hands. Lady Macbeth, in line 70, says, I hear a knocking. We have to go back to our bedroom. A little water clears us of this deed. Macbeth says, all the water in the world can't take this sin away, can't take my guilt away. Lady Macbeth basically just says, a little bit of sprinkles, clear it all up, no big deal. So you see the difference in the way they look at what they've done. Lady Macbeth feeling no guilt, here at least, and Macbeth feeling the weight of the guilt. Okay, so very different responses. So one thing to note here, the end of scene 2, interesting. They go back into the bedroom because they have to act surprised that Duncan's dead like everybody else. One of the things that's interesting here is that Shakespeare chooses not to show the murder of King Duncan on stage. The reason is because it would be bad form to perform the murder of a king in front of a king. Because remember, he's doing this play for King James. So it would be unwise to show King James the murdering of a king. Okay, so Shakespeare being smart there, being respectful to his patron, and saying, hey, we'll talk about this happening, but I'm not actually going to show it. I'm not really even going to describe it. Okay, we'll just accept that it's done, and then we'll move on. Now, he's safe even discussing this because he's going to show the repercussions, what happens when you go against God's will and kill the king, which is kind of the idea here. Remember, James was all about the divine right of kings. So that ends scene 2 of Act 2. So the beginning of scene 3 is comic relief. Okay, we've had all this tension. King Duncan's has been killed. There's lots of tension and stress. So Shakespeare throws in a funny scene to relieve some tension, give us a little catharsis. This is the porter. The porter is the doorman, and he is drunk, completely drunk. And so he's pretending that he is the doorman to hell anytime someone knocks and wants to come in. So that whole section, and notice that it's written in prose, not poetry, not to be taken seriously. Shakespeare is just kind of talking about, is just making fun. So lots of witty dialogue there that we won't really get into, but pretty funny things. And that brings us to the discovery. So everyone's like, hey, we're here to get Duncan, Macduff's, Lennox, that crew. And Macduff's like, oh, all right, let's go wake him up. And so they're like, man, by the way, we've been seeing some really crazy things here tonight. And Macbeth's like, what? And Lennox tells us the night has been unruly. Our chimneys were blown down, so there's been lots of storms. We heard all these strange screams of death in the air. All kinds of confused events. The obscure bird, which is the owl, hooted and clamored all night long, and there were earthquakes. Remember, Shakespeare has weather respond to people who are important. So Duncan was killed and nature responds, weather responds, okay? And that's why. So anyway, they leave and Macbeth kind of hangs out there talking to Lennox. Macduff goes to get King Duncan because he was supposed to be his alarm clock, comes back in, and they found out, oh, horror, 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 tongue nor heart cannot conceive nor name thee. And they're like, hey, Macbeth, ironically, what's wrong? And this is dramatic irony because we know that Macbeth knows that Duncan's dead because Macbeth killed him, but he pretends like he doesn't know. Anyway, and then, go look for yourselves. It's awful. And then everybody comes out in Act 3 and they're like, oh no, King Duncan's dead. What are we going to do? Looks like the guards did it. And Macbeth's like, man, I wish I would have died before this so I would not have to see the king is dead. Again, dramatic irony because we know that he killed him. However, nobody else does. And then they tell Macduff and Malcolm, or they tell Malcolm and Donalbain, what's wrong? Well, your dad's been killed. Malcolm and Donalbain are like, if they're killing dad, we better get out of here because they might want to kill us too. Then Macbeth does something clever. He says, we think it was the guards, and we could question them, except whenever I saw them, I got so angry at the thought that they had killed Duncan that I killed them too. So now that Macbeth has killed Duncan, framed the guards, and then killed the guards under the pretense of being so angry. But how convenient, right? Then they can't clear their names, all right? He's like, I couldn't help myself. I was so upset that I had to kill them. And then Lady Macbeth comes in, and they're like, oh, no, you can't hear about this. And she's like, I'm fine. Well, then she pretends to faint, or actually does faint. We don't know. But quite the actress, either way. And so they help her off stage. And then Macbeth's like, everybody's like, what do we do? And Macbeth's like, well, we're in our nightgowns. We better go get dressed, and then we'll figure it out. And at that point, Malcolm and Donalbain say, we need to get out of here because whoever killed Dad is probably going to try to kill us. So Donalbain says, I'm going to go to Ireland, and Malcolm's like, I'm going to go to England. And let's just wait there, see what happens, wait this thing out. And that's the end of scene 3. So scene 4 is a filler scene. It serves a practical purpose. We've got to switch scenes. We've got to change time. Actors have to go get in new clothing for Act 3 because a lot's going to change. So it represents the passing of time. Okay, so in this time, several things have happened. We've got an old man talking with Ross, and he's like, "Hey, tell me what you know." Okay, and so Ross is saying, lots of bad things have happened, and the world seems like it's on its head. The old man is like, "You're right. It's unnatural. The king's death is unnatural," and he starts talking about all the other unnatural things. There's a falcon that was killed by an owl. All right, so the lesser kills the greater, which is symbolic, of course, of Macbeth killing Duncan, the lesser killing the greater. Then you also have, he continues, Duncan's horses all went crazy, broke out of their stalls, and started attacking men. Okay, and then they ate each other. The horses did. So supposed to be very noble creatures, but kind of went crazy. Okay. So then Macduff comes in and he's like, "Hey, well, what's going on?" And he's like, "Did they find out who did it?" And Macduff's like, "Must be those that Macbeth had slain, those servants, those guardsmen." And he's like, "That doesn't make sense." And then he fills us in. Malcolm and Donalbain have run away. So since they ran away, it makes them look suspicious. Now we know they ran away because they were afraid. But Macbeth has taken to blaming Malcolm and Donalbain. Oh, they ran away. They must have killed the king. Now again, dramatic irony, because we know that Macbeth killed Duncan. Anyway, super important part that we find out, line 30, the sovereignty will fall upon Macbeth. Because it seems like Malcolm and Donalbain are guilty, the crown is going to go to Macbeth. So Macbeth is about to be crowned. They've buried Duncan. But here's the interesting thing. They want to know, hey, Ross asks Macduff, "Will you go to Scone?" Scone is where they are going to crown Macbeth. And Macduff says, "No, I don't think I'm going to go. I'm going to go to Fife." And he says, "Okay, well, why don't you go and see how things go?" Remember, we have a motif of clothing. He says, "I hope our old clothes sit better. Well, I hope that our new clothes don't sit worse than our old clothes." In other words, I hope Macbeth isn't a worse king than Duncan. In other words, what we're seeing here is that Macduff is already questioning Macbeth. He's suspicious of him and doesn't feel like he should be king. We know that because it's like a slap in the face that he doesn't go to Scone to watch Macbeth be crowned. Okay, so that's where we stand at the end of scene 2. Scene 4, Act 2. Duncan's been killed. Macbeth is about to be crowned King of Scotland. So it looks like the witch's prophecies are all coming true.